Good morning, everyone. On this new episode of Beyond Chronology, I welcome Professor James Hutson once again with his latest book, The Case Against Disclosure, pertaining to AI use in creative sciences, creativity and sciences. So, Professor Hudson, welcome to Beyond Chronology. Third time.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, and I noticed your book, which is right now on Amazon, The Case Against Disclosure. Along with I guess Dr. Daniel Plate.
Mhm.
Where you touched upon some very interesting issues, very, very important right now, especially for all of us scientists and creators who use AI for a lot of things. About disclosure. So, for instance, my motivation to invite you and talk about you was so I, as a scientist, submit journal articles to different journals. And we are in a flex situation right now where nobody knows how much AI use is permitted. Different journals have very different policies. A lot of journals ask you to disclose whether you used AI or not. And if you say yes, then in what capacity did you use AI? With some vague definitions about how much AI you can use or not use. The same is with the reviews. So while publishers boast how AI is improving their analytics and AI on their front, at the same time, when you review for journals, and which you review for free, by the way, we don't get paid to do that,
Mhm.
and it takes hours to review an article. Sometimes there's a strict policy that you cannot use AI neither to summarize your review, once you have actually put all your intellectual labor. And I'm pretty sure there are violations of that all over the place because I get reviews for my journal articles, my submissions as well. And I see, once you start using AI for long, you notice some patterns or punctuations, and you can easily figure out that definitely AI was used at a certain point. You can also figure out at what stage it was used. So it's all in flux, and there's a lot of risk of cancellation in the past, stigmas. Given that as a society we have not come to an agreement and as well as there are competing forces because there are people who do not believe how much AI should be used or AI should be used at all. And there's also a lot of disparity happening in productivity because of AI use, because some people are just getting better. So the way I consider AI is it's kind of an exponent. So if let's say the difference you're talking about two and three and you put an exponent of, two, then suddenly the difference from two to three goes to four to nine, which is actually, more than a twofold difference. Likewise, if somebody is actually performing substandard, given that that exponent works in reverse, for something like zero point 0.5, you become zero point 0.5 to the power of 2, you become 0.25. So the disparity is actually rising in productivity as well as the ability to, do very diverse kind of, things in performance and scientific enterprises. So, Professor Hudson, I've given you a little background of my motivation, and I want you to, take the mic and go forward with it.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. And you brought up a lot of points we can dig into there. I should go back to the birth of this particular manuscript. It's born, if you follow our research, especially myself and Dr. Daniel Plate, who is both a PhD in literature and creative writing. So he teaches a lot of creative writing and portfolio classes for English students. But he also, of course, has a graduate degree in human-centered artificial intelligence, and we've published over 200 articles on the subject. It really came from the somewhat hypocritical kind of approaches that a lot of professors and institutions have towards AI use. And so the volume itself is highly satirical and is meant to be polemical. It's meant to spark a discussion based on what we're assuming, right? So, and the assumption on the side of the academy and institutions that are highly bureaucratic is that the use of AI fundamentally is different than the internal production of knowledge and content of a human academic or scholar, right? Previously, so it all hinges upon internal and external kind of use. But let's go back to the Wild West, right? So the volume is really based on the argument that it's a romantic idea that we have this genius creator who can see the world in a particular way and can externalize what they're feeling internally. Usually, a single male, white European kind of creator, right? This mythos comes from the late 18th century and early 19th century, but we've moved past that since the 1960s, honestly, with post-structuralism in this notion of originality. So really the idea of requiring someone to lay out step by step how exactly they produce, say, a poem goes diametrically against this notion of creativity as they're defending it to begin with, right? So you cannot and would not in any other circumstance prior to AI have a creative break down how they wrote a novel or how they made a painting, right? So just the very idea is ludicrous. And so we just take that to the natural conclusion from the creative side and the scholarly side in the book to what the Copyright Office wants. And so it's based off of the first copyrighted artwork. And remember that you could copyright the text ever since 2023 when people started using ChatGPT. So that was never in question of being able to copyright the text produced by large language models. But it was the imagery. The imagery was the sticking point because for the Copyright Office and judges reviewing this, there wasn't enough human intervention and the human element that went into generating imagery, which of course is not true. There's actually more than what it takes to actually output an article, but we can come back to that. Anyway, so the first work of art, which is an American slice of cheese, if you remember that back in January, was the first one to get copyright for an artwork. And what they did really is mocking the US Copyright Office. So the US Copyright Office said, you have to demonstrate, right, that you had significant human contribution to a work if you want copyright for it. So they denied the others because it was more difficult to track how you were putting in prompts, modifying things, pulling them over into Photoshop or Illustrator, and doing some post-production work, etc. So what they did, which is entirely ironic, is they produced a work entirely by AI and then just asked the AI over 30 times to make minor changes. They didn't make the changes. This is a CEO, right, of a visual company. He didn't go in and with his hands or a keyboard or a mouse or a Wacom tablet, he didn't go into Photoshop or anything. He just sat there and told it what to do, kind of like vibe coding, right? So it's like, okay, now make this more blue, now move this up, now give this a reflection, now do this, and just recorded himself doing that over 30 steps, right? So so they submitted it, and based upon that recording showing the different elements, even though he didn't touch it, right, they had to grant copyright. And so that's just one of the extreme examples of the ridiculous lengths at which we're expected to document exactly what we're doing. But let's go back to your point. So that's kind of the creative side is, how do you document those aha moments you have while walking the dog or in a shower or when your brain goes into the default mode network, right? To where you're not consciously in control so you can access those more creative kind of leaps of intuition. Number one, you can't once again document those realizations, nor should we internally. But let's talk about scholarship, like you were mentioning. It is number one, of course, ridiculous because we're in this. Of course, disclosing, as you were mentioning, for scholarly journals, and or if you're going to go for a publisher or you're a reviewer, right, etc. It's of course impossible to state specifically how something was done, nor be able to tell exactly what was used in the creation of something and where the human intervention was. And that's really what people are trying to parse: is what did the machine make and what did the human make? And then what type of influence did the machine have over the human have over the machine when making content, right? So the problem is that it's a fluid tool use that we're seeing here. But it's very interesting in how we've set it up, and you hit the nail on the head there. So if you go into Amazon and you want to self-publish on Kindle, for instance, I did some tests for some creative writing students. We were going to show them how to get published, with their creative work. So over the summer, if you go into to Amazon or Barnes and Noble, right, so or any of the self-publishers, you have to state the three different levels. That being, did you use AI to generate all of the imagery without any post-production, right? So that being doing everything, yes or no. Did you use AI to generate some of the content, but just for improving grammar, right? So yes or no. Did you use AI to generate all of the written content? So what they're trying to get at is there are levels, these perceived levels of use that is permissible, right? So supposedly, no matter how complex the prompt I put in, right, to GPT-5, for instance, and say, I want you to look at, IEEE journals from the last 6 months. I want to look at instances of XR and 6 degrees of freedom. I want to focus on, no matter how detailed I showed my expertise, if I just hit generate and then copied what came out, according to them, it cannot be copywritten, right? But moving through that process, it's assuming that there are kind of 3 levels, right? The stoplight, which we're still kind of stuck on because we don't have a better model bureaucratically yet, right? So that being no AI use. So you just did everything yourself, which is, of course, impossible. If you go back to when word processors, right, and these other written tools were put together, no one writes things by themselves anymore. No one is even if you were to take a quill and an inkwell and that's technology you're using to externalize your thought, right? So, but again, you can't tell if someone knows how to spell consciousness, right? Because it's going to autocorrect for them. Or an email that you get, you don't know if it was suggested as an autocomplete, right? As a response for it. But it assumes no use, which of course in and of itself is impossible, but we'll stay there. The second one assumes some use, that being you generated it, but then did something to it, right? Very vague, right? That it's very vague as to how much editing, how much change, what did you do with it, etc. And the third one is all AI use. So seemingly, even though we have shown with the Supreme Court and a local inventor here that AI cannot produce something out of nothing itself, right? It requires a human to have it generate something. So the third option is actually impossible in and of itself, right? AI cannot spontaneously create something because then it would be sentient, right, in this way. And we refuse to give it copyright if the machine made something wholly on its own. Right. So, but those are the 3 categories that we have. So if we just break those down and think about it, it becomes very unevenly applied. There are assumptions, there are prejudices that go into it. So for instance, it is perfectly fine across all the journals that I'm aware of to use it to improve your grammar. So that being especially those who are scholars who English is not their first language. And so and they're publishing in English-speaking journals, right? So it is perfectly acceptable to run that through to make your introduction, your literature review, whatever that is, more grammatically correct, right? But then how exactly do we discern what element or what level, right, was taken from what they put in, right? So how can you say, I just used it for grammatical purposes, just like spell check, versus it added additional points of content that I didn't originally have in my first draft? Right. So you find that the way in which it's applied, we always have set up the system, especially in American publications, to privilege native speakers, right? And so it automatically is going to flag for like AI detection tools those that are ESL, non-native English speakers, and those that are neurodivergent. So it always is going to target them because of how writing is taught and how they're translating into another language, which is in and of itself, of course, just a bit racist. But we also need to think about it being sexist. I mean, they did a study, and male and female engineers, both using AI coding tools, were perceived differently, right? So that being the males, if using it, were not judged harshly or as negatively by their colleagues who weren't using it. But when women used it, it really called into question, according to the survey and the participants, the capabilities of a female engineer. So once again, even though the same use is there, we're viewing it very differently in kind of a sexist lens. So the way in which it's applied, as you mentioned, is very uneven, right? So you have, those that who are very good at the tools and were very good researchers and writers to begin with, that have just been augmented exponentially in what they're able to do. And then you have others that were not as good at writing, maybe English was their second language, etc., and they're going to get flagged for use, even though it's the same tools that they're using, right, in order to write up their work. But that's the primary premise. And we kept going back to Shakespeare because everyone likes to point to Shakespeare as the great writer, the great creative, right? So, but anyone who teaches English lit and studies Shakespeare knows he was about the biggest plagiarist you could imagine, right? So all of his major plays were just taken from previous works and then cast in Elizabethan names and attire and customs, right? So everything from the history of ancient Roman emperors, right, by Cicero and Ovid, you have these Pliny the Elder, right? You have him taking medieval, right, ballads and converting them for like a Hamlet as an example. So, talk to any of them. He very methodically did not have these genius levels of just spilling things onto the paper. He specifically did something mechanistically each time, which was take an original, an idea that he did not write, right? So modify it and cast it in new terms, right? So, but the formula was the same each time that he did it in this way. So this is why we're in this weird in-between period of knowing that even if someone doesn't want to use the tools, it's in Microsoft. I open up Microsoft Word, Copilot's right there. You open up Google Docs, the Gemini little star is right there, right? So you open up your email, right? It's already right there saying, would you like to use this response, etc. You already have autocomplete in your text. So it's really impossible to not use the tools, and it's kind of set up that way. But we're assuming that there is this pre-AI world that we can return to, and that this will just go away, and this isn't how we're going to create content, which is not true, right? But the system wasn't made for copywriting or this type of production. So then the question from a scientific standpoint becomes, I was thinking about what you mentioned coming in, because I review about 20 or 30 articles a week, and then look at the use cases across the scholarly life cycle, from like, idea and abstract to, paper to revision to article to reviewer feedback, right, to editor feedback. And it's through the entire cycle, right, that AI use has permeated. But what is interesting about the arts and sciences, fundamentally, this is something we have to grapple with and people don't admit. Is that number one, reading and writing are changing. That being, are people still going to read in the way in which they did pre-generative AI? Yes, but not for information, for pleasure, right? So people are still going to read poetry and fiction, right, and stories, right, and why do we still want to do that? Because we assume that we're seeing how another human being feels internally or thinks internally. right? So, but then there's the other classification of knowledge, right? Which is information, right? So that being reading for information. I might need to know how to fix my refrigerator, right? So I just need the facts. I just need the information. So that type of reading and of knowledge transfer is already rapidly changing, right? So that part is going to go away. But here's the kicker when it comes to some of the scientific journals that you mentioned, right? Some are like, oh yeah, sure, whatever, you can do whatever you want as long as we're judging, which is what we should be doing, judging the final work, not the workshop, right? So is the final work good? In this way. But some of them will say, oh, no, you can't use it, right? And so, which is interesting because from a humanistic standpoint, if someone were to submit a poem to a journal, it would make sense because the assumption is we're seeing in an unfiltered way how a human was feeling, not filtered through, right, a generative tool. So this is their internal life in this way. But from the scientific method standpoint, we shouldn't care about the political views and or the sexual orientation or how someone felt internally if they're going to be studying fusion or looking in chemistry. We should be judging it based upon the veracity, the effectiveness, the reproducibility of their results, right? So why then do we not allow researchers to use tools that are on the level of PhDs that could catch things that they miss if we're actually interested in advancing knowledge? If we're interested in advancing or patting someone on the back for how well they can communicate how they feel about something, okay, we're saying this is how you feel. But that's not what we're doing on the sciences, right? So in the science side, we shouldn't care, right? It's supposed to be objective, according to the research. It's supposed to use the best methods. It's supposed to look at all of the other work like it that has come before it, come up with a reasonable hypothesis and a methodology in order to try to move the field forward, and then report those results so they can be redistributed into that particular subfield, right? And others can learn from it and build on it. And we keep building and building and building. So the idea that you can't use a tool that objectively is generally better than most human reviewers, who studies have recently shown, there was one 2 weeks ago, that reviewers are much more likely to approve publication of an article that cites their own work,
Yes.
right? Because it validates them. It's like, no, I am the expert. I know what's going on. So if you cited me, obviously you know what you're saying.
Mhm.
And so, but machines don't think that way. Machines, it's like, okay, work through the math, work through the equations, work through what they have. Are there any flaws? Can we improve this methodology? Are the statistical analysis, is it accurate? Is, once again, the sample size relevant or too small, right, et cetera. That's all. That's just the machine doing its job, not thinking about, oh, they didn't. And for me to say that I don't feel a little tinge and a little cut to my ego when I go to review things that are in my very narrow subfield and they don't cite me, of course I'm hurt, right? You're just like, wait a minute, I wasn't cited here. I thought I did something important, but then again, I realize that and step back. But that's still something that we feel as humans. So then we really need to step back and think about, what are we doing with the type of research and writing that we have? What is reasonable documentation, right? So for it, if the assumption is you have to, in an unfiltered way, spill your guts about how you feel about something, right, in a poem, okay, if that's something that we agreed upon. If it's about writing something that is going to impact in a positive way a field, that's something else, right? So that's the premise of the book. But I'd love to hear your experiences as well.
Yeah, that was very informative. So you're right. You hit on the roots of that because I think if you look at the scientific enterprise, we publish a lot, like tens of millions of articles every year, and I myself am, I publish a lot, but we have this culture for the last few decades, a growing culture where focus was moving away from real, tangible targets of science to to again rewards which are basically externalized from actually scientific discovery. So, for instance, let's take at grants, right? We say grantsmanship. When we talk about grantsmanship, we never talk about the core ideas, how important they are, or what kind of discovery they will lead to. It is all about writing. It is all about dumbing down for those reviewers who might not understand your work but might still fund you. So we have a whole culture revolving around, a certain kind of grantsmanship, for instance, right? Where young professors spend disproportionate amount of time just to get funded rather to actually discover. When discovery was the whole premise of science, right? So likewise, in even in scientific writing, I mean, we know that there are cases where we just love people's writing style, for instance, completely disregarding what kind of science is being presented by that style. So there has been this change in science, especially you can call it the academization of scientific discovery, or I don't know what the proper word should be. And I think that suddenly AI is opening us to the vulnerability of that system, where suddenly the words are cheap and good writing style can also be cheap. In fact, you can take a manuscript of somebody else, put in the AI, train your own model to write in that particular fashion. So it is forcing us to put the weights back on scientific discovery and data. But given that we are entangled in a system which does not reward that directly, I think we are coming up with ways to, you can say, supposedly penalize for not playing with the uh, with the accepted norms.
No, absolutely. And so,
Yeah.
yes, so that being academia does not, if you break it down, reward and is focused on scientific discovery and or the promotion of a particular field or growth in a particular field. If you look at
Yeah.
it, that's
Those
not what
are
we reward,
those
right?
are those are byproducts of passion
Mhm.
of individual scientists. I mean, it happens, discoveries happen, but I don't think system is attuned for the. That's not a point which is optimized. Optimization is somewhere else. We have de-optimized, the system for actual discoveries.
And that's one of the main points we come back to again and again in the book is that if we follow the requirements which are untenable currently,
Hmm.
you can't really do it. You would be, as you mentioned, just doing bureaucratic reporting instead of producing something,
Yeah.
right? Just like you were saying, you have to go through the process of writing grant after grant after grant instead of actually doing the research, which you're trying to get funding to do the research. So it's a catch 22, right? In this way, when you could really just, with the amount of time and effort that you spent, depending on what type of experimentation you were doing, could have already done it, right? So
Of
without,
course. Yeah.
without the grant, but it doesn't validate you, right? It doesn't
Hmm.
elevate you in your field. It doesn't count towards tenure. It doesn't once again make you one of the foremost sought after scholars in X, right, etc. But that's kind of where we're at is, and you were mentioning certainly grant funding as we've seen over the past year is not objective in where we necessarily need it, but is
Of
also
course.
at the whims of politics and other considerations. So we have to consider, that as well, and then the Matthew effect, right? So, which is what you're talking about. So, a young scholar, unknown graduate student, just out, et cetera. Maybe they're an instructor, maybe they're an assistant professor, but they don't have a name yet. They're going to write grant after grant after grant after grant, but until they land that first one and then get the Matthew effect, which is, of course, after you get something, it's easier to get the next one and the next one, the next one, until you get
Yeah.
an embarrassment of riches to where they don't really have to do anything other than put their name on it, right? So this is how it works, right? Because you're a known entity. And I've been on the federal reviewing panels for grants, right? And it really does kind of work that way. That being, well, we haven't seen them before. We haven't seen how they would use the funds effectively. But this one submitted again for the third time, and we know that they gave us good results in the past. So we're going to do that because it's safe, right? So I've seen that.
And proportionately, those results are actually coming out of our ability to hire cheap labor in academia. So, because ultimately, that's what grants allow us to do, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean,
So,
just to think about it, luckily I was at the very end of that generation that kind of suffered that mistreatment, whereby you would yeah, and you were mentioning the number of publications, that being so in the sciences, less so social sciences, you do publish much more often, and your the rate of publication is much higher than it is in the arts and humanities, right? So they might publish a book every 5 years or 10 years,
Yeah,
right? Or maybe an article every 2 years, right? But if you're in the sciences, you might have to have 3 articles in a year, depending upon what you're doing.
right.
So there is a disproportionate way in which we judge certain types of output, which we need to admit. But you're right, that being, how do certain scholars of a previous generation, and hopefully not so much this generation, you can tell me, how were they so prolific, right? Because their graduate students were doing all their research and
Of
they were putting
course.
their name on it.
Yeah,
Right. Yeah. So of course they were able to do that. But then the grad students had no choice, because they needed, number one, to learn the ropes, to get a foot in the door and to have someone recommend them. Right. So as a mentor, to get in that first slot. Right. Even though it's really using their labor, as you mentioned, just like reviewers, for free. So the system really does reflect. You can see where the anxiety is coming from, right?
yeah,
In that it strips that away. Much of what the system was able to protect previously and support, as you were mentioning, content is cheap, right? That being, you can take someone's voice if you want, for like grant writing, right? If it was very successful, so it's kind of leveling the playing field in that way. But then at the same time, we have all this additional research. So then we would, in the past, to be able to, of course, read everything, be able
yeah.
to, elevate certain examples as, being higher quality than others, give papers awards, things like that. But we're getting to a point where we kind of need to admit, if you want your work read, and this is very controversial, but it's true, if you want your work to be read, you're not writing for your audience, you're writing for the AI that's going to pick it up, train on it, and then deliver it to your audience. So you're really using AI to write for AI, right? In this way, if you want your ideas to be,
More and more, I guess, because the use case of AI, especially for referencing and for in general, literature review, has been exponentially rising lately.
yeah,
So
we found it's very interesting how it does it, because we had my colleague as a blog, and he put it up last week, and then I did a lit review, and it pulled it right as part of the literature the following week. So it's really speeding up how it's gathering information more thoroughly, right, in this way. But yeah, if you want your work seen, it really, in the past, you would think you have an ideal audience in mind, that being, I have social scientists, or I have
yes,
chemistry professors, or I have literature professors that I'm writing for. But really, the ideas are going to be, no matter if you're using Google or whatever search engine you want, it's going to have that generative summary of what's pulled up, because people don't want to read through all of the links that are presented. So the original words are not as important as the message and the information that you are providing. So that those generative systems can parse it apart and reorganize it in a way in which your audience is trying to find that information. So really, the very way in which we find information is changing how, and the value of, right, our voice as authors. It really is about ideas. That being, can you have a good, original, creative idea, right? So and that's really what AI is not really good at yet, right? Is kind of creative thinking yet.
right.
But that's kind of what we're paid to do. The rest of it is kind of it wasn't significant to begin with, but
Yeah,
it is now cheap and automatable. But you're like, okay, so you have that spark, of genius. Like, wait a minute. So here's 4 studies, right, on this topic, but they didn't look at this one variable, which is so important, right? So that one idea is what people are going to take away from it. That being, oh, I didn't consider, age in this particular study as being an important variable, right? So they're going to look, okay, so now I'm going to look at age when I do my next study, et cetera.
Right.
Not the study itself. So really, we're kind of shifting in how we value information and how ideas are currency.
It's so interesting that 50 years back, before computers, when you had to write a literature review, I was not born, but this is what my professors have told. They have to go to the library. The libraries used to have certain abstracts, and that's how the journal structure is actually coming out of the old tradition, where they will have an abstract book. They'll just read through abstracts and titles. Then they would take out the interesting articles and then put a request to get the full copies of those articles, which will be shipped, a print copy. And then they would, review them, and then they will, cite them, and they would still have, some of those printouts. And still we have this off, whenever you have a publication, it's Springer or Elsevier asks, do you want to order off print? That print is actually coming out of that old tradition, which dates back a century almost. So now things change with computers. When a graduate student can do a literature review, within a few weeks, with the help of, Google search, and before Google search, other not so efficient search engines. So we are on a similar trajectory, to be honest. Like, things have not changed uh, qualitatively. It's the quantitative change now that we can do the same literature review in one day in terms of, getting the references at least, right? But we have the hesitation, and we have the, anxiety that's unacceptable, right? In fact, that should be acceptable. Likewise, we had a culture where when you ask a researcher, what they're doing, they're working on an article. People will moan about it, whine about it, that, it's so difficult to write an article, or I hate writing, I did love doing research. So before the AI, almost everyone would used to complain that, writing takes so much of time, I have to book the time, and, writer's block. I want to do research, I just don't want to do writing. But now we have AI, and people have stopped crying, no, 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 this is not good, right? So you're right. I mean, there's a lot of anxiety and hypocrisy at both individual and institutional level, which is working against AI adoption as well.
No, absolutely. And so it's very interesting. There was a study in June that was published to where they did a study in a matrix and laid it out for different disciplines of what would be possible, right, to automate with AI, what's not possible, right, and then across that spread out what people would want to automate and wouldn't want to automate. So it's very interesting to see there are things we absolutely can automate, but people say they want to hold on to it, right, in this way, that it's going to be that. Because somehow, as you mentioned, the sweat, the toil, the grind, right, is what makes it valuable. That being, especially in America, where you're told to pull yourself up by your bootstraps, and this kind of ridiculous kind of capitalist ideal that that work, right, that effort and time in a work equals the value of it. It's directly proportional. That being, the more time and effort you put into something, the more valuable supposedly that it is. But it's kind of interesting that you mentioned, what they were complaining about. That being, yeah, I could just be making more discoveries, and I could just be doing research, etc. But I have to slow down and report on this so that I could then get my ideas out there to get more funding, to do more research, right, in this way. But now we can just kind of cut out that middleman, just do more research, right? And so just like, okay, so now report on that, right? And so I'm going to go back, and then I'm going to build on what others have done. When I find it, I'm going to do more research, right? But that's one of those things that people are trying to hold on to, right, in this way, because it fundamentally threatens, the value of the whole academic enterprise. I mean, what are we doing here? What are we contributing? What does the PhD look like, kind of moving forward, right, in that way, as we've discussed previously. But no, you're absolutely right. But when you break it down, you were right as well, as that It's the quantitative difference. So how would you do research in the past? I didn't have a computer till I was in grad school. So you'd go to the library, you'd have your notebook, you'd copy down quotations and the citations of where you found it and the page number, et cetera. And you do this over and over and over again until you thought you had a sufficient amount of information to go back and write with. So you're copying verbatim, right, exactly what was in that in case you want to quote it later. Then you go back and you start typing it in, right, and organizing it. And then you might take the direct verbatim quotes and then summarize it or paraphrase it, moving on, and then reorganize it in such a way that made an argument, right? So that's exactly what these large language models do, is look at a bunch of different things, synthesize it, and then output it in that way. It's just doing it much faster, right? So, but the process is the same, right? Fundamentally, being here's all this information I want you to look at, right? Here's the peer-reviewed articles in this area, this field, right? So I want you to summarize it, look for key points, look for the prominent methodologies that are being used, right? And then give me a summary. Now let's think about a new study and the methodologies. So it's just assisting and kind of externalizing that process that had a lot of manual labor. I remember just handwriting notes, right? Hours and hours and hours and hours. And then you have to go back and redouble your effort by typing up those notes, right? So, and then cutting and pasting, reorganizing, and then rewriting those notes. And then we had my first PhD, we had to use Chicago manual style, which was just a beast because it's all footnotes. Yeah. And you have to, of course, have the footnote, remember how many times you've cited it, include that in the bibliography as well, and then include any additional information. So I love APA. I'll have to tell you right now, I love APA style. It is so much easier. But just doing that like on a typewriter, right, was just brutal, because if you need to put another footnote or endnote, you had to completely scrap the page, right, and start over because you had to type up another one at the bottom. But no, it just speeds it up. You're absolutely right. It's quantitative.
Yeah. No, that's true. I mean, but I also think that the system is actually lagging behind. So I think universities are trying hard, to give us access to AI and things like that. But the matrix of, science communication and the matrix of, training, I don't think that is keeping up with it, because with all the budget cuts, the future of, the depreciating public support for science, and public education in general, and more. In fact, if you look at the research funds, overall, research investment, if you see the proportion of that goes to AI now, it's even that is increasing. So the research for basic science is actually, although it looks good still, but even that is shrinking because a lot of that is going into AI one way or the other, right? So things are changing, and even our structure of how we run the labs and how we collaborate, I don't think it has kept up with it, because I don't know how long we will have a lot of young PhD students and young postdocs in the system, and how long we will have the pyramid structure, or maybe we will have those pyramid structure, but at a few institutions of higher priorities, and the rest of institutions might change in the nature. What do you have any ideas on that? Because that directly ties to the whole idea of the disclosure, because whether we have a disclosure policy or not has enormous implications on how one, what kind of risk one wants to take, and how much AI one has to adapt right now when the system is changing so fast.
No, absolutely. And so if we're talking about the evolution of the models, I guess we should back up and state that disclosure requirements at the moment are a bureaucratic attempt to slow down how quickly we're moving, right? So let's just start there. I just finished another article on the use of large language models in producing sermons, right, for preachers. And so as an example, it's not about the quality or even the content of what we're doing. It's about the audience's expectations, right? And so in those examples, study after study, the audiences that were polled, this is just North America, this is just Christian churches, Catholic and Protestant. But time after time, when they were told that it was solely AI generated, the audience felt kind of betrayed. They felt it was empty. empty, it was hollow, it didn't have that human insight and content. But if they weren't told that, they felt just like a human had written it, and or anyone else had actually produced it. So in the same way, as far as disclosure, we need to keep in mind the expectations of the human audience. I'm working on another book with the department head of theater here, and his whole point, he started showing how Shakespeare really just remixed and frankly plagiarized a lot of things that came before him, by showing how he took Shakespeare and then just reorganized it in the same fashion and process. But his whole point is the response of the audience is what matters, right? So how it was produced doesn't, if we're talking about the reaction of performative theater, right, and or performances in general, right? It's the reaction, the feeling that the audience has. But if you then tell the audience that it's entirely a machine that did all of this, then they, if their expectation was that it was a human, feel betrayed. So in the same way, as far as the changes, the disclosure is slowing it down. Number one, it's so inextricably tied to how content is generated across all of our platforms, from social media to word processors to everything that we do, that it's not going away, and it's just more pervasive. So it's the ideas that we're putting in are actually what matters, not the content coming out, even though we should be judging it on the work. But you asked about what impact this is going to have for organizations, and we've seen it as far as educational institutions. We see what's happening, which is, of course, less funding, which means and less interest in going to college. So here in the state of Missouri, where I am, only 34% of graduating high school seniors last May are going to college this fall. 34%. That's nearly just a quarter of all graduating seniors. So that is on trend with what we're seeing as far as the other avenues and the lack of interest in college in general. That being parents. I was talking to the head here of the city who's in charge of all admins, like the police officers, firefighters, engineering, etc. And I'm talking to him. He's like, "Well, I have a grandson who loves writing, but then I'm not going to tell him to go to college. What is he going to get out of college, right?" So that's happening. A lack of funding, regardless of political leaning. We're going to have a declining amount of funding for education if the broad majority of those that are going to pay for it, like parents, don't see the value in it. At the same time, we're seeing an increased value in more skills-based training and shorter certifications. That being, what in concrete fashion can you show me you can do, and can I get that certification and training relatively quickly and cheaply? So that's happening, right, to the chagrin of many academics who want to hold on to the older model. But there's also there's less funding for PhD, so you're going to have less graduate students to begin with, which means you're going to have less to assist you. You have the University of Chicago, right, just announced that it put a pause on its PhD programs. So
even though they have multi-billion-dollar endowment compared to many other universities,
yeah, they're incredibly well funded and known for it. And so this was a shock to people. It's like, oh my God, if they are halting PhD programs, what does that mean for those that aren't well funded, aren't as well known, and don't have as many graduate students applying? So there's less applying, there's less funding, there's less to go around. So you're going to have there's no other way. You're going to have a decline in the number of PhD graduates, right? In that system, because of that system and because of the funding that we're looking at. Now, with less people, that's also going to mean that what you do in the PhD is going to change, right? Because you don't have as many graduate students. You can't use them at the same level of like teaching 200 student seminars and doing the grading and everything, because there's not enough of them. There's not enough of them to do all the writing and the research and typing things up, right, that you discovered. So, kind of pass that off, because that's been automated as well. So what graduate school will look like will be fundamentally different just based upon those facts, right? So less of them. We have the tools that are going to change how we create and disseminate information and scholarship. It's going to become easier for graduate students to publish much earlier, right, because of the tools, and so that kind of offsets the power.
But at the same time, the value of those publications is down, right? So we don't know, we no more live in a system where you can have a, so if when I tell my students, talk to them, I tell them that, with your stipend, with your health insurance and the tuition, you are costing a PI or the university of whichever the system is paying for you, you cost about 300 to $400,000 across a 5 years PhD, right? A typical 5 year PhD, which is more than a bloody house, like a big house you can buy for that price. So that's the amount of money the society is spending on you. You might feel that you're getting paid less, but overall, this is what we are investing in you as a system, right? And then if we expect the old time, that, oh, you'll graduate with a thesis or you'll graduate with a publication after struggling, which just talks about like something minor which does not have any influence, then of course the societal, the propensity of the society to fund you will go down eventually because your productivity has not caught up with the technological developments. So our expectations have to structurally change from PhDs, regardless.
And it will also artificially inflate expectations, because I remember when I finished up my first one in 2008,
Yeah.
it wasn't an expectation that you leave with an article under your belt.
Hmm.
Now it is, right? So just a few years after that, right, if you're going out into the field and applying for an assistant professorship, you better have a published article, right, in this way. But now, because that's easier, cheaper, and faster, maybe you need 5 articles, maybe you need 10, maybe you need 2 books, right, before going out. And then it's just going to eventually inflate, right,
Inflate.
to such a point that it loses the value, right, and it kind of collapses and has to be replaced by something else. Because our measure, unfortunately, which is why we're still stuck with multiple choice exams and research papers, is we don't have an alternative. We're still building on that old system,
Yeah.
and so and our system now is still predicated on communicating authority and knowledge by way of writing, right?
Right.
And writing now is relatively easy and cheap. So what is our new system, right, for establishing authority and reputation and subject matter expertise? That's the big question, because it's just going to get ridiculously inflated, right, until we
Yeah.
answer that question.
Just like any currency, like just like currency inflation. I mean, credentials and currency are not very different in terms of, how they operate,
Mm-hmm. You're absolutely right.
right? Okay, so getting back to the disclosure, where do you see ultimately this whole disclosure bureaucracy moving forward? And by the way, I missed one question before when you said the bureaucracy is trying to hold us back when it comes to, with this disclosure, the AI adoption. Is that bureaucracy centralized? Is it like a bunch of people, sitting, together that deciding things, or is it emergent? And why? What's the benefit for the bureaucracy to actually, like, what's the motivation to slow the pace of AI adoption, especially in terms of academia and creative science, creative arts?
Sure. In 2023, the
Yeah.
motivation was risk aversion to litigation. So, that being, initially, it was people hearing that they're going to get sued, that they're going to violate FERPA, HIPAA, all these federal laws if they leak data, right, in this way. So that was the first reason to slow it down. And so
Okay.
and we saw that at my institution as well,
Hmm.
right? I wrote a policy, and then legal came back it came back with this draconian "don't use it ever" kind of thing, because they just, as with many others, don't want to get sued. You still have here the system in charge of education in the state of Missouri, DESE, their head lawyer. We're talking, to him, and he's like, "Oh no, we can't use it. Parents are going to sue us. We're going to get sued for leaking this. We can't let students use it." Like, okay, how many lawsuits have there been based on this in the state of Missouri? Well, none. How many have there been for educational institutions in the whole of the United States? None, right? And so I'm like, okay, so that was the first one, which was legal risk aversion. But then moving forward, it began to infiltrate more and more the systems by which people were holding power, the kind of hegemonic systems. So that being, your PhDs, your English departments, right? So your computer science departments, et cetera. Those that were threatened because their value, of course, was diminished, and or they might be, automatable. So that then became a kind of closing of the ranks. Like, wait a minute, let's slow down. And we still hear incorrect information that is reiterated and repeated in order to hold the lines in that way and to slow the dissemination. Like, no, 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 we still need all this. We still need to do things the old fashioned way. We still need, there's value in all of this, et cetera. And so you have kind of, but it was piecemeal. You're right. That being, as you mentioned, some publishers, maybe they're charging exorbitant APC fees, for open access or whatever. Maybe they're not. Some have disclosure requirements, some don't. So usually if they do, it is because either their constituents want the illusion that everything is still completely human generated, and that's where value is coming from, because that's how they perceive their value as experts reading these journals in the field, because they once again are going to have been bestowed their expertise in a previous way. But it is piecemeal. You're right. It is emergent in different areas, and there's different types and reasons for this type of disclosure mandates. But as far as moving forward, number one, they don't work, right? So, I mean,
Yeah, they don't work.
anyone who's going to be in these journals, with the button, they just have to not click it, right? And so the motivation to not click it is pretty high for those that are looking to get tenure and need, articles, et cetera. So why even bother, right? So there's the stakes are so low because they can't tell if in fact they used it or how they used it to begin with. In other ways, they would cut off all of their international researchers and publications if they weren't allowed to use it, right? So it's Grammarly is just, an older, slower version of ChatGPT that we've been
Yes,
using for decades.
that's true.
So we can't tell them no, or we're losing all, especially all the Asian scholarship, right? So,
Hmm.
and there's some good stuff, right, that they're doing.
Yeah.
Um, um, so we can't really, realistically do away with it. And then, as far as colleges are concerned, it's going to be used because it's built into technology. We can try to hold it off as much as possible. We can try to do oral exams and blue books. But here's the thing, is that over half of all the classes students take in the US, that's just all students aggregate, are online. Now, that includes on the students sitting in their dorms right now.
Yeah.
Most of the classes they're taking are online because that's what they want, right? And so that type of approach is not scalable, right? So you can't do the blue book and the proctored exam, and which by the way is easy to get around, right? I've been shown, strangely enough, or oral exams, right? Because they don't have enough time to watch 5-minute or 10-minute presentations of 30 students, right? So that's not scalable to begin with, and so that's going to collapse, and we'll have to find other ways to assess, which is what we should be doing, right? We should not be, we shouldn't have been assessing the product. We should have been assessing the process,
Process. Yeah.
because all we've been doing since high school is training them to be able to take good tests, to read a list of terms and regurgitate them in multiple choice. But that doesn't show us that they understand the principles of what you're teaching them. The process is what always mattered anyway. Can you show me you can think through this, right? Not that you can just, synthesize and or make something that looks good at the end that you know nothing about really, right? So that's why we're doing like an Integravise pilot, to where this is once again a stopgap measure, admittedly, but we're working with a company to where we have them upload their final project, their research paper, their report, their take-home exam, whatever, and then the AI pops up and quizzes them on what they submitted, so to see if they know what information is in there. Right.
Hmm.
So tell me more about this. You said this. Can you enlighten me on this, etc. So that's an in-between stage is what we're going to have next. Is that
Yeah.
type of automated system checking for knowledge, right? So do they actually know what they wrote? But again, we have to move. That's still checking and testing that final product, right? That we're still doing. We're not changing. We're still having them requiring that final research paper or exam, right? So we need in the middle, right? So like kind of project-based learning. How do we know that they're learning here instead of just from A to C? right? So, but you're right. And so, in the not Supreme Court, well, Supreme Court as well, but the U.S. Copyright Office, admitted back in January, yeah, this is how it's a tool. This is how we create stuff. So the level of disclosure or security theater, like the TSA at the airport, that you want will be dependent upon the audience, the type of publisher, and what's expected there. But no, this is how things are created and copyrighted and monetized. Even though you're going to have to make more and more to equal the same monetization because you can make more and more now, right?
Right, right. So one thing which we ignore, especially in the blue collar work, is that a lot of these things have already happened in the blue collar area. So for instance, when we are talking about CNC lathes, and now we have this completely automated lathes with, uh, micron precisions. Previously, people used to do that with hand, and people used to be rated on, what kind of measurement errors they have, what kind of variation they had in something round, let's say they make. And now we have these machines, very expensive lathes. And now it is all about whether you can operate those lathes or not. And you can have phenomenal products coming out of lathe. In fact, our whole industrial expertise is now based on these machines, right? So plumbers and electricians are part of the whole maintenance system, but our core manufacturing is very highly automated by people operating these machines, which can, reproduce, which can, be very precise, just like AI. So it's very interesting that how while all this automation was happening in the blue collar areas, we had no objection, from the whole society. But when it is coming to the white collar, enterprise, there's so much bureaucracy and there's so much of possibilities of litigation towards individual skills.
As long as it impacts someone else, right? You're
Yeah.
not going to see a lot of action. But as soon as it impacts the decision makers, those that are
Hmm.
writing these regulations, writing the laws, right,
Yeah.
in the courts, then you're going to see more action. You're right. But yeah, absolutely. You didn't see the same type of hand wringing and or the kind of theater that we're witnessing now when it was the blue collar. Like think of like a John Deere who instead of having a farmer driving a tractor, right, made the primary kind of creator and distributor of robotics for agriculture, across the U.S. Entirely automated. You don't need a
Yeah.
rancher farmer,
Hmm.
right, to be in those. And so no one really said anything at that time, right, in this way. But yes, once it impacts those that have a say and are making the law, then yeah, that's why we're seeing that now. But again, it's temporary. This
Right.
too shall pass.
So thanks to James. I have one last question, to you before we wrap up today, which is that uh, so are there any risks right now for people? Are there any risk in the future of past cancellation or litigation of people who are using AI now, without any concerns about these disclosures? Like, how comfortable are you saying just ignore the disclosures and go ahead with your creativity or scientific potential with, full throttle with it, with whatever AI technology is available right now and will be available?
Well, the argument really is based at those that are making these particular decisions, and just pointing out how they're not really concerned about creativity and or productivity or advancing a field. They're about bureaucracy and control.
Mhm.
So really, it was aimed at them. However, moving forward, let's say I'm trying to think of a world in which this would possibly happen, but let's say I cannot imagine it, but like all AI is wiped out, right? And you have in like 5 years, and you have a witch hunt from those Luddites or technophobes that blamed AI for the collapse of civilization or a rampant, world war or a recession, right? So that's it. Certainly is going to be you're going to see AI blamed for the jobs recession coming up. It already is. So then, in that instance, you theoretically could have a group that goes through and attempts to suss out all AI use and all content that was produced using AI tools. But what you're going to find is it is so pervasive and already in everything and how it's processed that everything will come up positive anyway. So it's kind of an interesting thought of those that may be concerned at this moment. And I know that there are many, like our students, are terrified, right? So they'll come in and like, no, we need to show you how to use these tools because you'll have to use them in your jobs. And they're horrified. They have been scared off of them by stating that whatever they put in, this misinformation, whatever they put in, they're going to lose the IP for, which is ridiculous, right? They're not going to be able to have control over what they put in a model or what they put out. But otherwise, the stigma of, oh my God, I use this tool, right? So now I'm completely discredited, right, as a creative writer. Which goes against the entire history of creative writing and creativity to begin with, because we always use tools when new technology came out in order to move us forward in any given craft. Painting, sculpture, creative writing, poetry, it doesn't matter. It's all the same. But yeah, as far as those, if they're really concerned, there's nothing in any of the current regulations which state that you can't, generate your first draft and then just reword it, right? So that's if that's really what you want to put every single word rewritten in your voice, that's fine. But if you don't use the tools, you're putting yourself at a grave disadvantage in any field because systems, if not other humans, are generating the content in competition with you. And so it behooves you to use or learn the technology as well.
Perfect. Thank you, Dr. Hudson. That was very, what shall I say, very comforting, both for me and for a lot of my audience. Uh, and uh, and this is just the beginning, of as you know what we have seen in the last 2 years, since we started talking. In fact, we started talking for 1 year itself, and how much you have produced, and how things have changed and people's acceptance and the bureaucracy. So great things to come, and I hope we'll have you again with discussing your new book or new ideas you touch upon. Yeah,
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. Everyone have a great day.
you too. Bye bye.